Reading The World Viewed, Reflections on the Ontology of Film by Stanley Cavell. 2. Sights and Sounds. The beginning of an answer is given by the two continuously intelligent, interesting, and to me, useful theorists I have read on the subject. Erwin Panofsky puts it this way, quote, "The medium of the movies is physical reality as such," end quote. Andre Bazin emphasizes especially this idea many times and many ways. At one point he says, quote, "Cinema is committed to communicate only by way of what is real," end quote. And then, quote, "The cinema is of its essence a dramaturgy of nature," end quote. Quote, "Physical reality as such," end quote, taken literally is not correct. That phrase better fits the specialized pleasures of tableau, vivants, or formal gardens, or minimal art. What Panofsky and Bazin have in mind is that the basis of the medium of movies is photographic, and that a photograph is of reality or nature. If to this we add that the medium is one in which the photographic image is projected and gathered on a screen, our question becomes, what happens to reality when it is projected and screened? Question mark. That it is reality that we have to deal with, or some mode of depicting it, finds surprising confirmation in the way movies are remembered and misremembered. It is tempting to suppose that movies are hard to remember the way dreams are, and that is not a bad analogy. As with dreams, you do sometimes find yourself remembering moments in a film, and a procedure in trying to remember is to find your way back to a characteristic mood the thing has left you with. But unlike dreams, other people can help you remember, indeed are often indispensable to the enterprise of remembering. Movies are hard to remember the way the actual events of yesterday are, and yet, again like dreams, certain moments from films viewed decades ago will nag as vividly as moments of childhood. It is as if you had to remember what happened before you slept, which suggests that film awakens as much as it enfolds you. It may seem that this starting point, the projection of reality, begs the question of the medium of film, because movies and writing about movies have from their beginning also recognized that film can depict the fantastic as readily as the natural. What is true about that idea is not denied in speaking of movies as, quote, communicating by way of what is real, end quote. The displacement of objects and persons from their natural sequences and locales is itself an acknowledgement of the physicality of their existence. It is as if, for all their insistence on the newness of the medium, the anti-realist theorist could not shake the idea that it was essentially a form of painting, for it was painting which had visually repudiated, anyway, far gone, the representation of reality. This would have helped them neglect the differences between representation and projection. But an immediate fact about the medium of the photograph, still or in motion, is that It is not painting. An immediate fact about the history of photography is that this was not at first obvious. What does this mean? Not painting? Question mark. A photograph does not present us with, quote, likenesses, end quote, of things. It presents us, we want to say, with the things themselves. But wanting to say that may well make us ontologically restless. Quote, photographs present us with things themselves, end quote, sounds, and ought to sound false or paradoxical. Obviously, a photograph of an earthquake or of Garbo is not an earthquake happening, fortunately, or Garbo in the flesh, unfortunately. But this is not very informative. And moreover, it is no less paradoxical or false to hold up a photograph of Garbo and say, quote, that is not Garbo, end quote. If all you mean is that the object you are holding up is not a human creature. Such troubles in notating so obvious a fact suggests that we do not know what a photograph is. We do not know how to place it ontologically. We might say that we don't know how to think of the connection between a photograph and what it is a photograph of. The image is not a likeness. It is not exactly a replica or a relic or a shadow or an apparition either, though all of these natural candidates share a striking feature with photographs, an aura or history of magic surrounding them. One might wonder that similar questions do not arise about recordings of sound. I mean, on the whole, we would be hard put to find it false or paradoxical to say, listening to a record, quote, that's an English horn, end quote, there is no trace of temptation to add, as it were, to oneself, quote, but I know it's really only a recording, end quote. Why? Question mark. A child might be very puzzled by the remark, said in the presence of a phonograph, quote, that's an English horn, end quote, if something else had already been pointed out to him as an English horn. Similarly, he might be very puzzled by the remark said of a photograph, quote, that's your grandmother, end quote. Very early, children are no longer puzzled by such remarks, luckily. But that doesn't mean we know why they were puzzled or why they no longer are. And I am suggesting that we don't know either of these things about ourselves. Is the difference between auditory and visual transcription a function of the fact that we are fully accustomed to hearing things that are invisible, not present to us, not present with us? Question mark. We would be in trouble if we weren't so accustomed, because it is the nature of hearing that what is heard comes from some place, whereas what you can see, you can look at. It is why sounds are warnings or calls. It is why our access to another world is normally through voices from it, and why a man can be spoken to by God and survive, but not if he sees God, in which case he is no longer in this world. Whereas we are not accustomed to seeing things that are invisible or not present to us, not present with us, or we are not accustomed to acknowledging that we do, except for dreams. Yet, this seems, ontologically, to be what is happening when we look at a photograph. We see things that are not present. Someone will object, quote, that is playing with words. We're not seeing something not present. We are looking at something perfectly present, namely a photograph, end quote. But that is affirming something I have not denied. On the contrary, I am precisely describing or wishing to describe what it means to say that there is this photograph here. It may be felt that I make too great a mystery of these objects. My feeling is rather that we have forgotten how mysterious these things are, and in general how different things are from one another, as though we had forgotten how to value them. This is, in fact, something movies teach us. Suppose one tried accounting for the familiarity of recordings by saying, quote, when I say listening to a record, quote, that's an English horn, end quote, what I really mean is, quote, that's the sound of an English horn, end quote. Moreover, when I am in the presence of an English horn playing, I still don't literally hear the horn. I hear the sound of the horn. So I don't worry about hearing a horn when the horn is not present, because what I hear is exactly the same, ontologically the same, and if my equipment is good enough, empirically the same, whether the thing is present or not, end of quote. What this rigmarole calls attention to is that sounds can be perfectly copied, and that we have various interests in copying them. For example, if they couldn't be copied, people would never learn to talk. It is interesting that there is no comparable rigmarole about visual transcriptions. The problem is not the photographs are not visual copies of objects, or that objects can't be visually copied. The problem is that even if a photograph were a copy of an object, so to speak, it would not bear the relation to its object a recording bears to the sound it copies. We said that the record reproduces its sound, but we cannot say that a photograph reproduces a sight, or a look, or an appearance. It can seem that language is missing a word at this place. Well, you can always invent a word, but one doesn't know what to pin the word on here. It isn't that there aren't sights to see, nor even that a sight has by definition to be especially worth seeing. Hence, could not be the sort of thing we are always seeing, whereas sounds are being thought of here, not implausibly, as what we always hear. A sight is an object, usually a very large object, like the Grand Canyon or Versailles, although small Southern children are frequently held by the person in charge of them to be sights, or an extraordinary happening, like the aurora borealis. And what you see when you sight something is an object, anyway, not the sight of an object. Nor will the epistemologist, quote, sense data, end quote, or, quote, surfaces, end quote, provide correct descriptions here. For we are not going to say that photographs provide us with the sense data of the objects they contain. Because if the sense data of photographs were the same as the sense data of the objects they contain, we couldn't tell a photograph of an object from the object itself. To say that a photograph is of the surfaces of objects suggests that it emphasizes texture. What is missing is not a word, but, so to speak, something in nature. The fact that objects don't make sights or have sights. I feel like saying objects are too close to their sights to give them up for reproducing. In order to reproduce the sights they, as it were, make, you have to reproduce them, make a mold, or take an impression. Is that what a photograph does? Question mark. We might, as Bazin does on occasion, try thinking of a photograph as a visual mold or a visual impression. My dissatisfaction with that idea is, I think, that physical molds and impressions and imprints have clear procedures for getting rid of their originals, whereas in a photograph, the original is still as present as it ever was, not present as it once was to the camera. But that is only a mold machine, not the mold itself. Photographs are not handmade, they are manufactured. And what is manufactured is an image of the world. The inescapable fact of mechanism or automism in the making of these images is the feature Bazin points to as, quote, satisfying once and for all, and in its very essence, our obsession with realism, end quote. It is essential to get to the right depth of this fact of automism. It is, for example, misleading to say, as Bazin does, that, quote, photography has freed the plastic arts from their obsession with likeness, end quote. For this makes it seem, and it does often look, as if photography and painting were in competition, or that painting had wanted something that photography broke in and satisfied. So far as photography satisfied a wish, it satisfied a wish not confined to painters, but the human wish, intensifying in the West since the Reformation to escape subjectivity and metaphysical isolation, a wish for the power to reach this world, having for so long tried, at last hopelessly, to manifest fidelity to another. And painting was not, quote, freed, end quote, and not by photography from its obsession with likeness. Painting in Manet was forced to forego likeness exactly because of its own obsession with reality, because the illusions it had learned to create did not provide the conviction in reality, the connection with reality that it carved. One might even say that in withdrawing from likeness, painting freed photography to be invented. And if what is meant is that photography freed painting from the idea that a painting had to be a picture that is of or about something else, that is also not true. Painting did not free itself, did not force itself to maintain itself apart from all objective reference until long after the establishment of photography, and then not because it finally dawned on painters that paintings were not pictures, but because that was the way to maintain connection with the history of the art of painting, to maintain conviction in its powers to create paintings, meaningful objects in paint. And are we sure that the final denial of objective reference amounts to a complete yielding of connection with reality? Once, that is, we have given up the idea that, quote, connection with reality, end quote, is to be understood as, quote, provision of likeness, end quote, question mark. We can be sure that the view of painting as dead without reality and the view of painting as dead with it are both in need of development in the views each takes of reality and of painting. We can say painting and reality no longer assure one another. It could be said further that what painting wanted in wanting connection with reality was a sense of presentness, not exactly a conviction of the world's presence to us, but of our presence to it. At some point, the unhinging of our consciousness from the world interposed our subjectivity between us and our presentness to the world. Then our subjectivity became what is present to us. Individuality became isolation. The route to conviction in reality was through the acknowledgement of that endless presence of self. What is called expressionism is one possibility of representing this acknowledgement. But it would, I think, be truer to think of expressionism as a representation of our response to this new fact of our condition, our terror of ourselves in isolation, rather than as a representation of the world from within the condition of isolation itself. It would, to that extent, not be a new mastery of fate by creating selfhood against no matter what odds. It would be the sealing of the self's fate by theatricalizing it. Apart from the wish for selfhood, hence the always simultaneous granting of otherness as well, I do not understand the value of art. Apart from this wish and its achievement, art is exhibition. To speak of our subjectivity as the route back to our conviction in reality is to speak of romanticism. Perhaps romanticism can be understood as the natural struggle between the representation and the acknowledgement of our subjectivity, between the acting out and the facing off of ourselves, as psychoanalysts would more or less say. Hence Kant and Hegel, hence Blake secreting the world he believes in, hence Wordsworth competing with the history of poetry by writing himself back into the world. A century later, Heidegger is investigating being, with a capital B, being, by investigating Dasein, because it is in Dasein that being shows up best, namely as questionable, and Wittgenstein investigates the world, quote, the possibilities of phenomena, end quote, by investigating what we say, what we are inclined to say, what our pictures of phenomena are, in order to wrest with the world from our possessions so that we may possess it again. Then, the recent major painting, which Freud describes as objects of presentness, would be painting's latest effort to maintain its conviction in its own power to establish connection with reality. By permitting us presentness to ourselves, apart from which there is no hope for a world, photography overcame subjectivity in a way undreamed of by painting, a way that could not satisfy painting, one which does not so much defeat the act of painting as escape it altogether, by automism, by removing the human agent from the task of reproduction. One could accordingly say that photography was never in competition with painting. What happened was that at some point the quest for visual reality, or the quote memory of the present, end quote, as Baudelaire put it, split apart. To maintain conviction in our connection with reality, to maintain our presentness, painting accepts the recession of the world. Photography maintains the presentness of the world by accepting our absence from it. The reality in a photograph is present to me while I am not present to it, and a world I know and see, but to which I am nevertheless not present, through no fault of my subjectivity, is a world past. And I was reading Sights and Sounds in the World Viewed, Reflections on the Ontology of Film by Stanley Cavell.